The cold wind swept across the battlements of the dread fort, rustling the crimson banners of House Bolton and causing the flayed man emblazoned upon them to dance in the moonlight. Within the castle's walls, Roose Bolton stood with his hands folded neatly behind his back, surveying the courtyard below with unreadable eyes. The men of the dread fort were busy finishing their nightly duties. Some carried torches, others sharpened blades, and their footfalls echoed against the ancient stones. Their lord looked on in silence, pondering the future of his house in these uncertain times. News had spread from King's Landing that Lord Eddard Stark, Warden of the North, had been executed for treason, and in the tumult that followed, his eldest son Robb Stark had called the banners to avenge his father. Roose Bolton was among those who answered, for loyalty to the Starks, however tenuous it might have seemed in the eyes of some, was not something he would toss aside lightly. Yet, just as urgent as the realm's turmoil was a more private concern. His bastard son, Ramsay Snow. A savage glint burned behind Ramsay's dark eyes, a cruelty that Roose recognized early on. The boy was violent, remorseless, and cunning when it suited him. Roose himself was no stranger to ruthlessness. He had maintained order in his lands through methods that other lords might find distasteful, but Ramsay's impulses went beyond what was merely efficient. Controlling the boy was a delicate dance, one Roose knew was essential if House Bolton was to remain a respected, and perhaps even feared banner of the Starks. He did not want Ramsay's sadistic appetites to define them. There was advantage in harnessing that cruelty for the battlefield, but none at all in letting it run rampant upon innocent small folk or the allies they were sworn to protect. Roose turned from the battlements and descended into the courtyard, his expression placid as always. Though it was late, he ordered for his horse to be readied. Robb Stark's campaign in the south required urgent action, and Roose meant to depart for the battlefront by morning. He passed among the men as they hurried to assemble fresh supplies, barrels of salted meat, casks of ale, and crates of bolts for crossbows. A hush trailed in his wake, for the Dreadfort's lord had a knack for sliding silently among them, as though even the air bent to his quiet, calculating will. He paused near a brazier where the red glow of coals lit up the cold night and beckoned to Ramsay, who stood off to the side wearing a small, cruel smile. "You leave with me at dawn," Roose said in a low voice. "But let us be clear, my son. This is war, and we shall have a place in it. We ride under the banners of House Stark, and you will hold your bloodlust in check. Do you understand me?" Ramsay met his father's gaze with a flicker of defiance, but he bowed his head. "As you command, father." For a moment, Roose's pale eyes narrowed. He could sense the tension in Ramsay's stance, the unwillingness to submit fully, but they both knew the consequences of rebellion. Roose might have been mild in speech, but he was never shy about correcting disobedience, particularly from his bastard. If Ramsay failed him, the punishment would be swift. "Good," Roose said. "Now ensure our men are prepared. You will lead a small company on the flank, but remember, any cruelty you display must serve House Bolton. No pointless flaying, no hunts of those under our protection. If you must spill blood, spill it with purpose and with my leave." Ramsay's lips curved in that half-smile again. He bowed and departed, already relishing the thought of the battles to come, but mindful of the tight leash his father was keeping around his throat. Roose glanced once more at the flayed man on his banner. It was a sigil that commanded fear, and he intended that fear to work in the Starks' favor. If the Boltons proved their loyalty in the war to come, and if Ramsay could be reined in, their family would emerge stronger than ever. The illusions of affection or warmth were not relevant to Roose. It was alliance that mattered. The Starks were revered by the common folk of the North, and by tying Bolton fortunes to their cause, he stood to grow more powerful in the wake of whatever changes this war brought. If their new king in the North triumphed, the Bolton name would be etched in the halls of honor. And if that king should fall, there would always be a means to secure Bolton interests anyway. Regardless, Roose would play the game shrewdly. Morning light came thin and pale over the horizon, and the Bolton host set forth from the Dreadfort. Ramsay rode near the front, flanked by a small cluster of men whose loyalty to him was absolute. ruffians and soldiers who shared at least some appetite for violence. Roose allowed them their air of menace. War was not a matter for illusions of kindness. Even in serving Robb Stark, Roose would not pretend to be what he was not. The roads were cold and dotted with frost-laden trees, and crows called overhead as the host rode south. By the time they joined the main Stark army on the outskirts of Moat Cailin, the sun had climbed higher, shimmering with a pale glow over the bogs and wetlands. Men from all over the north had converged here. Karstark soldiers with their sunburst sigils, Umbers with their roaring giant, Manderleys with the merman, Serwins with the black battle-axe on silver, Glovers, Tallhearts, and more. They pitched tents amidst the rocky causeway. Roose guided his horse forward, scanning for the large, stout pavilion that belonged to Robb Stark, the newly proclaimed king in the north. Flanked by his personal guard, the silent lord of the Dreadfort dismounted and motioned for Ramsay to follow him to the command tent. Inside, Robb Stark stood over a rough-hewn war table with a map of the Riverlands and the north stretched across its surface. His mother, Lady Catelyn Stark, was at his side, along with Ser Brynden Blackfish Tully. Great John Umber loomed on the other side of the table, his broad arms crossed and a half-grin on his face, while Lord Rickard Karstark studied the map with a grim intensity. Several other lords were gathered, exchanging ideas and strategies in hushed tones. When Roose and Ramsay entered, a slight lull followed as eyes turned toward them. Robb looked up. Though he was young, a fierce determination lit his blue eyes. "Lord Bolton, your men are most welcome." Roose bowed his head ever so slightly. "My king, you have them, and me at your service." He gestured to Ramsay. "My son, Ramsay Snow, who shall command a flank if it pleases you." Ramsay stepped forward, kneeling briefly, though his eyes darted around the tent to gauge every presence. He wore a thin smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "Your Grace," he said. Robb acknowledged him with a nod. Then he turned his attention back to the map. "The Lannisters believe they can keep my sisters as hostages in King's Landing. They believe the North will bend. We will show them they are wrong. But first, we must move swiftly through the Riverlands to relieve my grandfather's bannermen under siege." Catelyn's voice was soft but resolute. "Our people are being harried in the west as well. Word has reached us that Tywin Lannister's army stands near Harrenhal, and my brother Edmure faces repeated raids along the banks of the Red Fork." Ser Brynden Tully nodded. "We need a strong strategic victory. The Lannisters won't yield the Riverlands without a fight. But if we can catch one of their commanders off guard, we might force them to release more men or retreat from certain positions." Roose studied the map. "My king, if I may suggest, the Lannisters will anticipate that the young wolf might attempt a direct confrontation. Perhaps we should consider dividing our forces to keep them uncertain of your next move." He saw the faint flicker of emotion on Robb's face. Uncertainty or perhaps intrigue. By all accounts, Robb Stark was still new to war, but he was learning quickly. He turned to Roose. "I am already considering dividing the host. A smaller force under my command can move quicker. You and your men would be essential in any diversionary tactic." "I stand ready, your grace," Roose replied. He did not volunteer a cunning plan yet. He needed to measure Robb's readiness to use brutality. But time would tell. Roose prided himself on being methodical after all. Over the course of the next few days, the Northern Lords refined their plans. Ramsay participated sparingly, more intent on exploring the camp and eyeing potential victims than he was on forging alliances. With Roose's warning still burning in his mind, Ramsay did not act on his more vicious impulses, but he took note of men who irritated him. He singled out a few that disrespected him or made jokes about his bastardy and quietly dreamt of the day he might punish them under the auspices of war. When the army finally marched south to cross the Neck, Roose Bolton's bannermen rode at the forefront of the flanking column. Robb split his army into two divisions. One, led by himself, would move toward the western Riverlands, hoping to draw Tywin Lannister's main force. The other, commanded by Roose, would travel a route further east, giving the appearance that they might cross near the Twins. It was a bold strategy that required precise timing. If Roose was delayed or crushed, Robb would be vulnerable. Likewise, if Robb was trapped, Roose might find himself outnumbered by Lannister forces. The key was for each to divert the enemy and then regroup to strike at a more opportune time. As the Bolton host began its trek through the soggy terrain of the Neck, Roose and Ramsay rode side by side, father and son in uneasy proximity. Roose studied the land carefully. Every step was dangerous. He knew the crannogmen who inhabited these swamps could be allies one day and distant observers the next. But so long as they remained loyal to House Stark, Roose had no quarrel with them. He also knew Ramsay was growing restless. The quiet, the damp, the slow progress. These things chafed at the younger man, who was eager to sink his blade into foes. "Are we ever going to see a proper fight?" Ramsay asked, his voice low. "War is not a game," Roose admonished. "When we do fight, you will unleash yourself upon the true enemies. But until then, curb your appetites." Ramsay sighed and clicked his tongue. "As you say, father." They pushed through the Neck, forging south until the land gave way to the rolling fields and forests of the Riverlands. There, a gloom of war already hung over the villages. Houses stood scorched, crops flattened, and the meager folk who survived wandered the roads, refugees in their own lands. Where Lannister men had passed, stories of pillage and horror followed. If Ramsay took any enjoyment from hearing these tales, he hid it well in front of his father. For his part, Roose kept his face expressionless, but inside he pondered the best way to use Ramsay's penchant for terror against the Lannisters. He was careful to keep Bolton men from senseless raiding or cruelty against small folk. The Dreadfort's reputation was formidable enough without further tarnishing their name in the eyes of potential Stark allies. As they approached a small hamlet that lay in smoldering ruins, Roose halted his men. The stench of burnt wood and flesh wafted on the breeze. Not far from the main road, a few battered survivors cowered, uncertain if these new arrivals were friend or foe. A woman clutched a child to her chest, her eyes swollen with tears. Two older men stood behind her, trembling but defiant. Roose rode forward slowly. "We are men of the North, sworn to House Stark. Have no fear. Has the Lannister host been here?" he asked in a quiet tone. One of the older men nodded. They came a few days ago, my lord. Took what we had, burned the rest. Killed my son for daring to speak back. Sent a few back to Harrenhal as prisoners." Roose glanced around. Ramsay had halted his horse just behind him, scanning the devastation with a curious smirk that he quickly masked when Roose turned to look at him. The other Bolton soldiers stood in disciplined rows, awaiting orders. "We will see if we can spare some rations," Roose said, turning to one of his captains. "Provide them bread and water. We continue forward, but note where the survivors remain. In time, we might send them more help." Ramsay tilted his head, perhaps surprised at his father's small gesture of mercy, but he said nothing. Instead, he watched as the starved woman and child knelt to the ground, tears of gratitude welling. Bolton men passed some provisions, though they did so with a certain grim reluctance. The war had barely begun, and already resources were scarce. Still, to maintain their image as loyal northern allies, it was a necessary act. They pressed on, following the path of destruction left by the Lannister columns. Crows circled overhead as they passed fields blackened by fire. They learned from scattered refugees that several small Lannister detachments ranged ahead, plundering anything of value. It was precisely the opportunity Roose Bolton needed. A quick, decisive strike against these marauders would serve two purposes. First, it would protect northern and riverfolk from further suffering, and second, it would provide a sanctioned outlet for Ramsay's bloody desires. Near dusk, their outriders reported that a Lannister foraging party, perhaps 50 men strong, had halted by a shallow stream to rest and water their horses. They seemed complacent, unaware of any nearby threat. Roose assembled his captains in a small clearing to discuss a swift attack. "We cannot allow them to continue pillaging this region," Roose said, his voice a soft monotone. "We strike at daybreak, quietly and from two sides. That should ensure minimal losses on our part." The captain nodded in agreement. "And with your leave, Lord Bolton, We'll set a few men upstream to block their escape across the water." Ramsay stood at the edge of the gathering, eyes bright with anticipation. "Let me lead the forward assault, father." Roose regarded him with careful scrutiny. This was the moment to test whether Ramsay could be an asset rather than a liability. "Very well, but listen to your captain's counsel. There is to be no needless cruelty. Do not prolong their suffering. This is not the place for you to indulge your every whim. We strike swiftly and end it." Ramsay inclined his head, but Roose could see the hunger in his eyes. Whether the young man would heed his father's rules remained to be seen. "I understand," Ramsay murmured. Night settled over the camp, and a hush fell among the Bolton soldiers. They sharpened their swords in the dim firelight, murmuring of the coming battle. Some men prayed. Others drank small draughts of ale to steady their nerves. Roose wandered among them, a ghostly figure in the flickering glow, ensuring discipline was maintained. When he came across Ramsay, he found the bastard sitting near a campfire, toying with a knife. Two of Ramsay's close followers hovered by him, men known for their brutality. Drennan and Sour Allen, sworn swords who seemed to delight in intimidation. Ramsay flashed a grin at his father's approach. "Should we truly not take any prisoners, father? The men might find it fun to question a few Lannisters about their plans." Roose's voice was quiet but firm. "Any you capture, you bring to me alive and unharmed. Do you understand?" "Alive and unharmed," Ramsay repeated with a mocking smile. "As you command." Roose held his gaze for a moment longer, then left. He doubted Ramsay would show gentleness to any captive. But if the bastard went too far, Roose would ensure he learned the cost of disobedience. In the back of Roose's mind was the lingering question of whether bringing Ramsay on this campaign might prove his undoing. Still, if properly harnessed, Ramsay could be House Bolton's secret weapon. Savage, fearsome, and cunning. Before the first light of dawn, the Bolton men slipped from their camp and moved through the thick brush toward the shallow stream. The faint glow in the eastern sky illuminated the Lannister encampment in the distance. A few tents clustered near the water, with horses tied up to graze on sparse grasses. A single guard walked the perimeter, yawning in the chill morning air. Ramsay's forward unit spread out, creeping through the high reeds. The main Bolton force waited behind a small ridge, ready to descend upon the unsuspecting foragers at Roose's signal. When the guard turned his back, Ramsay signaled his men to move. They sprang from hiding, blades glinting as they rushed toward the tents. Stifled cries of alarm rose in the Lannister camp. One guard managed a quick shout, "Attack!" before Ramsay's knife opened his throat. The tents erupted with panicked soldiers scrambling to find weapons. Chaos spread like wildfire. The Lannister men had no cohesive defense. Many fell where they stood, half-armored and sleep-clouded. A few tried to rally near a wagon, lifting crossbows, but by then, the second wave of Bolton soldiers, led by Roose's captain, charged in from the flank. Screams filled the morning air. Ramsay fought with a savage glee, letting his blade slice through any Lannister he could reach. He relished their terror, the frantic wideness in their eyes. He had not felt the full exhilaration of sanctioned killing in some time, and every muscle in his body thrilled at the sensation of hot blood spattering against his leathers. Still, a part of him remembered his father's warning, "Kill with purpose." As the Lannisters scattered, a handful tried to mount horses and flee, but Bolton bowmen positioned upstream fired at them, cutting them down. In less than half an hour, it was over. The entire Lannister foraging party lay dead or dying, save for two men who had been captured. Ramsay and his loyal acolytes had seized them. Neither was unscathed, but they still lived. The rest of the Bolton forces stood amid the carnage, counting their own losses, which were minor. Roose Bolton arrived, his expression impassive as he surveyed the bloody scene. "Well done," he said softly. Then his gaze fell upon the prisoners. They were younger men, likely foot soldiers from some minor Westerland's house. They shivered in fear, hands bound, eyes darting between the Boltons. Ramsay stood beside them, a smear of blood across his cheek and a dangerous light in his eyes. "Shall we question them, father?" Roose nodded. "Indeed, but in my presence. And keep them alive." An impromptu interrogation took place near the charred remains of a campfire that had been kicked apart during the skirmish. The two captives offered trembling answers about troop movements and the location of Lord Tywin's main force. They knew little of strategic value, but they were certain Tywin was operating near Harrenhal. Ramsay seemed to grow restless as the questioning continued. More than once, he cast a hungry glance at his father, as though waiting for permission to employ more brutal methods. But Roose's instructions were clear, and so he refrained, contenting himself with subtle intimidation. He would snap the blade of his knife close to the prisoners' faces, or trace the flat edge along their cheeks, making them shudder. When Roose had gathered what little information they had, he stood, brushing dust from his cloak. "Kill them," he said simply. Ramsay's grin flared, and he stepped forward. But Roose raised a warning hand. "Quickly," he said. "No games." For a moment, disappointment flashed across Ramsay's face, but he complied. 2 swift thrusts, and the prisoners slumped, their blood darkening the dirt. Roose watched without a hint of emotion. The men of House Bolton had grown accustomed to such ruthless efficiency. Many in the ranks quietly thanked the old gods that their lord knew how to handle a war. If it were not for Roose's steady hand, Ramsay's cruelty would already have run wild, and the Bolton name might once again be whispered as the vilest in the north. But so long as Roose guided that bloodlust, House Bolton could stand unstoppable. They advanced deeper into the Riverlands over the next week, engaging in skirmishes with small Lannister detachments and driving them back. Word spread among scattered villages and hamlets that a band of fierce northerners, led by the silent and cunning Lord Bolton, was punishing the Lannisters for their raids. More refugees gathered behind the Bolton host, hoping for protection. Though Roose did not actively encourage them to follow, neither did he turn them away. They were living proof of the North's vengeance, and once again, it strengthened his ties to the Stark cause. There was a certain value in being seen as defenders, even if the Bolton style of defense was unervingly cold. All the while, Ramsay vented his appetites in battle after battle, butchering Lannister men with savage thrill. He learned to keep it reined enough that his father did not intervene or punish him, and so the tension between father and son settled into a precarious equilibrium. The Bolton soldiers noticed Ramsay's penchant for cruelty, but as long as it was directed at the enemy, few complained. The war was giving the bastard a stage upon which to thrive, and under Roose's strict orders, that cruelty became a fearsome weapon turned squarely against the Lannisters. Eventually, the northern scouts reported that Robb Stark had scored a victory in the west, capturing Jaime Lannister himself in a cunning ambush. Cheers rang through the Bolton camp at the news, though Ramsay's excitement was more about the potential shift in the war's fortunes than any admiration for Robb. Capturing the Kingslayer was no small feat, and it meant the Lannister forces would feel a sharp blow to their morale. Roose recognized the significance immediately. The war might shift drastically now, and for the Starks to hold Jaime as a captive was a strategic advantage that could not be overstated. If Tywin wanted his son back, he would need to negotiate, or attempt a dangerous rescue. Then came the order from Robb to advance toward Harrenhal. The cursed castle was rumored to be only lightly defended, as Tywin had marched the majority of his men elsewhere to search for Robb. This left an opportunity to take Harrenhal and secure a key position in the Riverlands. Roose assembled his men and began the grueling march, leaving behind a trail of battered but liberated villages. As they approached the imposing silhouette of Harrenhal's melted towers, anxiety and excitement pervaded the ranks. An immense fortress, Harrenhal was as infamous for its curses as it was for its strategic importance. Taking it could give the Northerners a powerful foothold. When they arrived, they found the gates barred and a small garrison of Lannister men inside, though not nearly enough to hold against the combined might of the Bolton host. Harrenhal's black walls loomed overhead, war-scorched spires reaching into the sky like the fingers of some monstrous beast. Roose quickly established a siege perimeter, cutting off supplies and allowing no one to enter or leave. Days passed in tense stalemate, with the Lannister commander refusing to surrender. Catapults were brought up, but Harrenhal's walls were thick and built to endure. Nightly raids tested the fortress's defenses, as small groups of Bolton men attempted to scale walls or sabotage gates. Ramsay grew agitated at the slow pace. "We should storm the gates and kill them all," he hissed to his father one evening. "Let me lead the charge. We'll paint the halls of Harrenhal with their blood." "That would cost too many lives," Roose said. "Patience, Ramsay. They will run out of food eventually, or their morale will crack. Blood for the sake of blood does not win wars." Ramsay glowered, but he recognized that no matter how savage he felt, he would not defy his father's direct order. Instead, he channeled his frustration into leading small infiltration teams through the night, discovering weaknesses, and every so often capturing a guard or killing a patrol. At times, he let one or two survivors flee back to the castle, ensuring they spread word of the horrors inflicted upon their captured comrades. Psychological warfare was something Ramsay excelled at, and under Roose's tacit approval, it was proving effective. The Lannister men inside Harrenhal began to fear the flayed man of House Bolton far more than they had before. On the 11th day of the siege, a small band of Lannister soldiers attempted to break out at night, perhaps hoping to slip away under cover of darkness. Bolton sentries spotted them, and a brief, bloody engagement ensued. Ramsay personally led the interception, and come dawn, not a single Lannister soldier from that group remained alive. Their heads were placed atop pikes near the siege lines as a grim warning. Though Roose did not openly display the practice, he allowed it. He recognized that fear was a potent force, and if it hastened Harrenhal's surrender, all the better. Finally, news reached them that Tywin Lannister was still far away, possibly engaged with Robb's forces near the crag. With no relief coming, the weary defenders of Harrenhal hoisted white flags over the parapets. Roose led a contingent to the gates. The Lannister commander emerged, defeated, to sue for terms. The man's face was etched with exhaustion, his eyes bloodshot from long nights of worry. He knew the rumors of House Bolton's brutality, especially the bastard who led terror raids in the dark. Roose quietly demanded the unconditional surrender of all inside Harrenhal, promising that their lives would be spared if they laid down arms. The Lannister men, out of options, complied. Thus, the Boltons entered Harrenhal largely without bloodshed, securing the fortress for King Robb Stark. A minor victory, perhaps, but a critical one in controlling the central riverlands. The next day, a raven arrived with the king's command. Roose Bolton was to hold Harrenhal and maintain the surrounding territory, while Robb moved further south to press the war effort. When Ramsay learned that his father would remain in command of the largest castle in the Riverlands, he smirked with dark satisfaction. This was power, tangible and immediate. The Boltons, once overshadowed by the Stark name, now had a substantial seat from which they could exert influence far from the north. In the Great Hall of Harrenhal, its vaulted ceiling blackened by dragonfire centuries past, Roose sat upon the dais once held by Harren the Black. Patches of the stone walls had melted in places, giving the fortress an unsettling aura. His captains and officers stood below, discussing logistics, food supplies for the garrison, patrol routes, and scouting missions. Outside, the Bolton banners hung from the walls, and the flayed man overshadowed the Lannister lion that had once flown there. Some of the local small folk peeked through the gates, unsure whether to fear or welcome their new overlords. That afternoon, in a private tower chamber that served as Roose's command room, he received a number of local lords and landed knights who had managed to survive the Lannister occupation. Most were Tully bannermen who had hidden or been forced into submission. Now they sought to swear fealty, or at least secure some arrangement under the Bolton caretaker. Roose listened impassively to their petitions, making measured promises of protection. He could sense their unease, for the stories of Bolton cruelty had reached even these lands, and they knew that the flayed man was not a sigil to be taken lightly. But they also recognized that King Robb Stark had delegated authority to Roose. If they wanted to keep their lands and titles, they had little choice but to accept. Ramsay lingered behind his father's seat, quietly observing. Occasionally, He would let slip a small snicker when one of the local lords stammered with fear, or he might fix them with a predatory stare. Roose allowed it to a point. He knew that a measure of intimidation served his purposes, but he would not let Ramsay's sadistic appetites break any prospective alliances. House Bolton could not afford to turn these local powers into rebels. When the lords departed, Roose turned to Ramsay. "I see you are eager to remind them of the Bolton reputation." Ramsay shrugged. "Fear is a strong foundation for loyalty." "True," Roose conceded. "But you must learn to judge the line between instilling fear and driving men to desperation. We rule effectively by letting them believe they can survive under our protection. If they lose all hope, they may rise against us." The bastard feigned boredom, but Roose's words settled somewhere in his mind. He might have preferred open terror, but he understood the wisdom in his father's approach. For all his cruelty, Ramsay was not entirely without cunning. Weeks wore on, and Roose entrenched himself in Harrenhal. Scouts rode forth daily, observing the movements of any remaining Lannister or allied forces, while patrolling local villages to ensure that bandits did not exploit the chaos. Letters arrived by Raven from King Robb Stark or Lady Catelyn Tully, conveying fresh war developments. Stannis Baratheon had also declared himself king and was marching on King's Landing. The realm seemed poised on the brink of fracturing into pieces. Amidst this turmoil, House Bolton served the king in the north, and grew more powerful by the day, holding one of the largest castles in Westeros, even if it was a castle with a haunted history. Throughout all this, Ramsay found new ways to amuse himself. He led small squads to hunt down Lannister stragglers. Occasionally, they captured men who had deserted from Tywin's army and sought to hide as brigands. Ramsay relished these hunts, cornering the deserters in abandoned farmsteads or isolated woodlands. While Roose demanded a semblance of discipline, he allowed Ramsay to conduct interrogations that frequently ended in blood. As long as these men were clearly the enemy, the rest of the Bolton soldiers turned a blind eye. Rumors spread among the Riverlands that Bolton enforcers had turned to flaying Lannister deserters alive, though no one could confirm the tales for certain. Some said they heard screams in the night, drifting across the lake that surrounded Harrenhal. Despite the horror, some local peasants found relief in the fact that bandit raids dwindled wherever Ramsay hunted. Criminals and enemy scouts feared venturing too close to Bolton-held lands, not wanting to face the savage bastard. In a grim sense, Ramsay was fulfilling his father's directive: keep order through calculated terror. One chilly morning, a raven from Robb Stark arrived bearing urgent news. The king in the north required additional forces to confront a renewed threat by Tywin Lannister. Under normal circumstances, Roose would have simply marched out to join his liege lord, but holding Harrenhal was a strategic mandate as well. He could not leave it undermanned, for if the fortress fell back into Lannister hands, the entire Riverlands campaign could unravel. So Roose compromised. He selected a portion of his best troops, 2,000 men, to ride south and reinforce King Robb. Ramsay immediately volunteered to lead them. He practically bristled with excitement at the thought of returning to the field in a major engagement. But Roose hesitated. He knew sending Ramsay unrestrained could lead to unspeakable atrocities, damaging their alliance with the Starks and potentially unifying the Riverlords against House Bolton. Still, the advantage of having Ramsay's ferocity on the battlefield was undeniable. After deliberation, Roose summoned Ramsay to the tower chamber. "You will lead half the detachment," he said, watching as the younger man's eyes glinted with delight. "But I am appointing Captain Giles to share command. You will consult with him before making any major decisions. If you fail to do so, or if I receive word that you are slaughtering innocent smallfolk or allies, your punishment will be severe. Do not test me, Ramsay." A flicker of annoyance crossed Ramsay's face, but he nodded. "I understand. I will do as you command." Roose said nothing more, only dismissed his son with a slight motion of his hand. As Ramsay departed, the older man let out a slow breath. It was always a risk to let the bastard roam, but war was a time for taking carefully calculated risks. If Ramsay distinguished himself under Robb's banner, House Bolton's star would rise higher. Better to keep him close to the main Stark army than cooped up in Harrenhal where his impulses might fester. 2 days later, Ramsay departed Harrenhal at the head of 1,000 Bolton troops, alongside Captain Giles leading the other 1,000. The men marched in disciplined columns, their armor freshly polished, their banners snapping in the wind. At their head, the flayed man of Bolton flew proudly, an unsettling contrast to the banners of so many other northern houses that displayed more conventional symbols. Ramsay rode a black horse, wearing dark leathers with subtle highlights of red. He exuded an air of lethal confidence, scanning the countryside with restless eyes. Captain Giles, a seasoned soldier of few words, stayed close at hand, fulfilling Roose's command to keep an eye on Ramsay. They traveled for several days, crossing the Trident at a shallow ford, then moving southwest according to the directions provided by the king's scouts. At each village they passed, they found signs of war, burned homes, frightened peasants. Ramsay made a conscious effort to maintain discipline. He did not waste time on petty cruelties, though sometimes he lingered on the edges of a settlement, scanning for any excuse to let out his sadistic urges. Giles, ever watchful, kept the men on task. While few suspected how tenuous that leash might be, it held, for now. Eventually, they arrived at Robb Stark's encampment, a sprawling sea of tents near a bend in the Red Fork of the Trident. The northern host was large, bolstered by riverlords loyal to House Tully. Ramsay's arrival did not go unnoticed. Men stepped aside to make room for the Boltons' approach. Great John Umber stood near one of the larger tents, bellowing laughter as he drank from a large tankard. When he saw Ramsay, his laughter slowed, and he let out a sharp grunt. "Ho there! I see Lord Bolton's men have arrived. Where is that cunning old weasel?" Umber asked, though not entirely unkindly. Ramsay reined in his horse. "My father remains at Harrenhal to secure it. I am Ramsay Snow, his son. He has sent me with 1,000 men to reinforce the king in the north." Umber regarded Ramsay, suspicion flickering in his eyes. "Ah, the bastard. I've heard tales of you. We'll see if you can fight as fiercely as they say." He jerked his head at the tents. "The king will be wanting to see you soon enough." Ramsay dismounted, the rein in hand, and signaled to the Bolton column to make camp. As he strode through the lines of northern soldiers, he noticed them giving him sideways glances, some whispering behind his back. He was used to the scorn that came with his bastard name. Here, though, it felt more than mere scorn, it felt like caution. The stories of House Bolton's methods had clearly circulated. A savage grin tugged at Ramsay's mouth. Let them be wary. Better fear than mockery. By the time he entered the royal pavilion, he found Robb Stark seated at a table, maps strewn about, with Lady Catelyn by his side, along with the Blackfish and several other commanders. They paused in their conference as Ramsay stepped forward. He knelt briefly as protocol demanded. "My king," he said, pitching his voice to sound respectful. "I bring the forces of Lord Bolton as commanded." Robb surveyed him. "Rise. My thanks for your timely arrival. Tywin Lannister has regrouped, and word is he marches to relieve the siege of Riverrun. We mean to intercept him before he can do so." Catelyn studied Ramsay's face, and he could almost sense her unease. The Lady of Winterfell was no fool. She knew men's reputations. Still, she offered a polite nod. "We appreciate the support of the Dreadfort's men." Ramsay bowed his head, feigning humility. "We stand ready to fight for the North." He felt an undeniable thrill. He was here at the heart of the Northern War effort, entrusted by his father, recognized by the king in the north. This was his chance to prove his worth, to carve a name for himself that was feared across the realm, not merely scorned as a bastard. Perhaps, he mused, one day the name Ramsay Bolton might carry as much weight as Roose Bolton's. But for that, he needed victory in battle, and he would savor it. Over the next few days, King Robb Stark conferred with his war council, finalizing plans for how to meet Tywin Lannister's army. Scouts reported that the Lannisters were moving swiftly, using forced marches to cross the northern riverlands with haste. Robb intended to maneuver them into a disadvantageous position near a series of wooded hills where his archers and cavalry could excel. Once there, the trap would be sprung, and if all went well, Tywin would be forced to retreat or risk annihilation. Ramsay found himself assigned to the flank again, much as he had been at the outset of the war. King Robb explained the rationale. The Bolton soldiers had proven their effectiveness in pincer maneuvers, striking enemy supply lines or rear guards. The memory of the earlier victories, such as the battles near the Whispering Wood, lingered in the army's mind, and a carefully orchestrated flank attack by ruthless Bolton troops could tip the balance. Ramsay was all too eager to reprise his role. On the morning they marched to confront Tywin, the northern host emerged onto rolling hills blanketed by sparse trees and tall grass. The sky above was gray, threatening rain. Tension simmered in the ranks as they formed up in battle lines. Trumpets sounded in the distance, announcing the Lannister approach. Sure enough, columns of crimson and gold soldiers appeared on the far side of the plain, their armor gleaming in the weak sunlight. Ramsay rode along the flank with Captain Giles, occasionally exchanging curt nods with the men behind them. Robb Stark and his main force positioned themselves near the center, flanked on one side by the Umbers and Karstarks, and on the other by the Glovers and Manderleys. Ramsay's detachment stood further out, partially hidden by a low rise in the terrain, poised to sweep in at the critical moment. The air was thick with the smell of horses, sweat, and anticipation. With a thunderous roar, the Lannisters began their advance. Lines of infantry marched forward, banners flying, spears bristling like a steel forest. Their crossbowmen followed close behind, ready to unleash bolts at the northern lines. Robb Stark's archers loosed volleys of arrows, darkening the skies, and men on both sides cried out as they fell. The clash of steel soon echoed across the hills, and the battlefield descended into a frenzy of chaos, with men hacking, stabbing, screaming. Ramsay waited, adrenaline coiled within him like a spring. He kept his gaze on Robb's standard, watching for the signal. Minutes felt like hours as the main armies collided. Then, at last, the Stark banners dipped in a certain sequence, the prearranged sign. Captain Giles shouted, "Now!" and the Bolton flank exploded into motion. Horsemen thundered forward, swords and axes raised. Why? Take Ramsay at the vanguard. His heart hammered in his chest as he led the charge, brandishing a curved blade. The Lannister ranks on that side had been pinned by the main northern force, leaving them vulnerable to a sudden flank attack. Ramsay's soldiers crashed into the enemy lines like a hammer blow. Men in crimson cloaks whirled, eyes wide with sudden terror, as the flayed man of Bolton bore down upon them. The resulting carnage was swift and brutal. Ramsay exulted in the slaughter. He felt no fear, only a savage exhilaration. The swirl of battle was a place where his darkest impulses found open license, but still he recalled Roose's admonition, "Kill with purpose." So he aimed his blows at Lannister soldiers, hacking them down, spurring his horse onward. Crossbowmen scattered, trying to reload under the onslaught. The Bolton cavalry trampled them into the grass. In a matter of minutes, the entire Lannister flank buckled. Their commanders scrambled to reorganize, but the combined pressure of Robb's main force and Ramsay's flank attack was too great. Captain Giles, astride a chestnut mare, bellowed for the Bolton infantry to press forward. The ground turned slick with mud and blood as they advanced. More Lannister men dropped their weapons and fled. A triumphant roar rose from the northern lines. Ramsay spurred his horse on, pursuing a cluster of retreating enemies, letting his blade taste more blood. The momentum was unstoppable. Soon the entire Lannister force began a fighting withdrawal, unable to hold its ground. King Robb's cavalry harried their retreat, while Ramsay and his men cut off smaller pockets of men, capturing or killing them. Tywin's banners were seen in the distance, presumably at the head of his main column, though sightings were confused. Rumor spread that Tywin himself fled the field once he saw the battle lost. Whatever the truth, the Lannisters were in full retreat, leaving behind the dead and dying. When the clash finally subsided, the field belonged to the north. Bodies littered the grass, and crows began to wheel overhead. The victorious northern men set about tending to their wounded and collecting valuable prisoners. Ramsay took a moment to survey the chaos, dismounting from his horse. His heart still pounded with the thrill of it all. In the distance, Robb Stark's banners flew high, another resounding triumph for the young wolf. And for House Bolton, it had been a day of savage glory. As the men tallied casualties, Captain Giles approached Ramsay, wiping blood from his brow. "We lost fewer than 200. The enemy losses are thrice that, if not more. Your charge was well executed. The king will be pleased." Ramsay smirked. "I aim to please." But even as Giles turned away, Ramsay caught sight of some Lannister survivors, perhaps a half-dozen soldiers who had thrown down arms, raising their hands in surrender. The Bolton men herded them into a small cluster, awaiting orders. One soldier lay wounded, clutching at a bloody gash in his side. Another had an arrow lodged in his thigh. They looked terrified. Ramsay's mouth twitched with interest. He strolled toward them, ignoring the stench of death. One of the captives whimpered, "Mercy, please." "Mercy," Ramsay repeated, almost tasting the word. "Ah, yes, the king in the north might grant that. But you're in Bolton custody now." He heard a cough behind him and turned to see Captain Giles watching, his expression guarded. Ramsay recalled his father's strict command. Quickly, he plastered on a thin smile. "We'll take them as prisoners, of course. His Grace will likely trade them or interrogate them. No sense wasting good leverage." Captain Giles gave a wary nod, then beckoned the Bolton men to secure the prisoners and see them properly detained with the rest of the captives. Ramsay moved aside, frustration simmering beneath the surface. So many were begging to be broken. Yet even now he had to keep appearances. This was not just any battle. It was part of House Bolton's carefully cultivated loyalty. With Tywin on the run, there would be bigger opportunities. Patience. That evening, the camp was filled with the sounds of grim celebration. Soldiers recounted their feats, toasted the king in the north, and shared stories of the day's glory. Healers moved among the wounded, trying to save those they could. Catelyn Stark supervised the triage, her face weary but determined. In the royal pavilion, Robb Stark and his commanders convened for an impromptu war council, celebrating the victory and contemplating their next moves. Ramsay stood among them, alongside other lords and captains. "The Lannisters are in disarray," Robb declared. "They'll be forced to fall back, maybe regroup at Harrenhal or King's Landing. This might give us the time we need to reinforce Riverrun properly and secure the Riverlands once and for all." The Great John let out a booming laugh. "Let them run like rabbits. We'll hunt them down soon enough." Catelyn, more cautious, offered, "We must not overextend ourselves. Another of Tywin's hosts could be waiting. We should consolidate our position, see to the wounded, and fortify the roads to Riverrun." Robb glanced around, his gaze settling on Ramsay. "And my thanks to you and your men, Ramsay Snow. Your father's men fought bravely and helped secure our victory on the flank." A small ripple of surprise moved through the pavilion. It was not common to see the bastard of Bolton praised so openly. Ramsay inclined his head. "We are honored to serve, Your Grace. We only did our duty." This momentary spotlight thrilled him. He felt the eyes of the northern lords upon him, some with grudging respect, others with caution. But the recognition was undeniable. He, Ramsay, had proven himself on the field, not merely as a rumor of cruelty but as a legitimate battlefield commander. Perhaps one day that might even lead Robb Stark to legitimize him as Ramsay Bolton. The possibility glimmered in his mind. In the weeks that followed, the war rolled on in shifting tides. The Northerners secured Riverrun, driving out any lingering Lannister pockets. Tywin Lannister, forced to yield ground, consolidated his forces closer to King's Landing. Stannis Baratheon's threat loomed in the east, and Renly Baratheon's fleeting claim had collapsed after his mysterious death. Across the realm, new alliances and betrayals blossomed like poisonous flowers. Yet through it all, House Bolton's standing rose. Roose remained at Harrenhal, receiving frequent missives from Robb praising the performance of the Bolton men. The tension between the Bolton name and the other northern houses seemed to lessen, at least on the surface. Catelyn Stark, in her private reflections, was not entirely at ease with Roose Bolton's methods or the presence of Ramsay Snow. But she could not deny that this alliance with House Bolton had become critical to Robb's success. Roose had proven reliable and resourceful, and his bastard, while unsettling, obeyed the king's orders, not indulging in the atrocities that gossip suggested he was capable of. Or at least, if he did, it was directed solely at confirmed enemies and remained largely hidden from the Allied forces. Whether the monstrous stories about Ramsay were exaggerated or underplayed, it hardly mattered so long as the Boltons continued to fight Lannisters, not their fellow Northerners. At Harrenhal, Roose solidified his grip. He systematically replaced any questionable officers in the fortress with men loyal to him. He saw to the local peasants, ensuring they had enough provisions to avoid starvation, if only to prevent unrest that might undermine his rule. He corresponded with Lord Walder Frye, forging a cautious rapport, though Roose knew Walder Frye was an ally of convenience at best. Still, it never hurt to keep lines of communication open, especially in a realm as fractured as Westeros. Ramsay, meanwhile, roamed the Riverlands with his contingent, hunting down any Lannister remnants or bandits. He grew in fame or infamy, becoming the dark whisper that spread through the taverns. If you wear a lion's sigil, beware the bastard of Bolton. Thanks to Captain Giles's balancing influence, the worst of Ramsay's cruelty was kept in check. But there were always rumors. Tales of Lannister scouts disappearing and turning up later with strips of skin missing, or the cries of torment drifting from the Bolton campfires at night. If any of these reached King Robb, they were delivered quietly and overshadowed by the fact that Ramsay's men were undeniably effective at quashing resistance. In time, the war took another turn. Robb decided to shift his forces, moving south toward the Westerlands to threaten Tywin's home domain. Casterly Rock was too formidable to besiege directly, but striking at the Lannisters' seat would force Tywin to divide his forces further. Ramsay and his 1,000 men were ordered to join the campaign, which once again delighted him. It meant fresh battles, fresh terror, and fresh victories. In his rare moments of introspection, Ramsay wondered if his father might be proud, or if Roose merely viewed him as a tool, possibly both. Yet, for Ramsay, it hardly mattered so long as he had a place to unleash his darker passions. The day they rode west, the sky was bruised with storm clouds. Lightning flickered in the distance, casting pale forks across the horizon. The Northern Army, a long column of infantry, cavalry, and supply wagons, trundled along muddy roads. They passed farmland that had been stripped bare by the war, and villagers who stared at their banners with mixtures of hope and dread. Ramsay rode near the front with several other commanders, his bastard sigil overshadowed by the direwolf banners carried by Robb Stark's standard-bearer. Occasionally, Ramsay turned his gaze skyward, noticing how the crows seemed to follow them, as if anticipating the next feast of corpses. The column halted when outriders raced back to inform them that a small Lannister force was encamped near a crossroads a few miles ahead. Robb Stark, never one to shy from bold action, decided to engage at once. He summoned his commanders in a roadside clearing to discuss the approach. Ramsay stood on the fringes of the meeting, quietly observing. He had learned to read the subtle signals in Robb's body language and recognized that the young wolf was growing weary of the war's grind, but still determined to press his advantage. "Reports say they're 200 men, mostly mounted," Robb said. "A small enough force. We can overrun them easily, but I suspect they're forward scouts for a larger host. We need to handle them quickly and quietly." The Blackfish nodded. "I'll take a detachment of outriders and flank them from the east. We can cut off their escape route." Robb turned to Ramsay. Would the Boltons be willing to handle the western approach? This wooded terrain. There might be hidden watchers. Ramsay inclined his head. "We're well accustomed to dealing with such. We'll smoke them out if needed." With the plan set, the army continued until they reached the outskirts of the crossroads at dusk. The Lannister scouts had pitched a small camp beside a winding road. Torches flickered among the tents, and the silhouettes of patrolling guards could be seen against the backdrop of the trees. The northern forces spread out, positioning themselves to encircle the camp. Ramsay led a group of 100 men through the dense thicket on the western side, stepping carefully over roots and low branches. Rain began to drizzle, dampening cloaks and muffling footsteps. Ramsay signaled his men to halt as they neared the edge of the clearing. His eyes narrowed, scanning for pickets. He spotted one Lannister guard leaning against a tree, yawning, apparently unworried about an attack on such a wet night. With silent gestures, Ramsay directed 2 Bolton archers to take him down. A short, sharp twang of bowstrings, and the guard crumpled wordlessly. The path was clear. He advanced a few more steps, heart racing. Then he heard the distant cries from the other side of the camp. The Blackfish's men must have launched the eastern flank. Shouting erupted as Lannister sentries sounded the alarm. Trumpets blared. "We're under attack," men yelled. Swords clashed, steel glinting in the torchlight as Robb's main force swept in from the north. Ramsay seized the moment. "Forward!" he hissed, and the Bolton troops surged into the camp from the west. Panicked Lannister scouts, half-armored, scrambled to respond, some mounting horses, others trying to form a shield wall. But the northern onslaught crashed into them with unstoppable fury. Ramsay's men fought with a methodical savagery, hacking down any Lannister in their path. Despite their small numbers, the Lannister scouts fought back fiercely, aware that they needed to delay the Northerners at all costs. Ramsay spotted a knight in crimson armor rallying a handful of riders, urging them into a desperate countercharge. Arrows whistled, men screamed, and horses whinnied as they collided with the Bolton line. Ramsay sidestepped a charging horse, slashing its flank, causing the beast to topple and fling its rider. He laughed, a harsh sound, as he drove his blade into the fallen knight. Around him, the night was alive with thunder and lightning, the rain picking up intensity. Fires sparked from overturned torches, casting wild shadows on the soaked ground. Ramsay could feel the mud sucking at his boots, the metallic tang of blood mixing with the wet air. He thrived in this chaos. Time blurred, each heartbeat a rush of violence. Eventually, the cries of battle subsided. The Lannisters lay dead or captured, their camp in ruins. Lightning illuminated Robb Stark riding through the aftermath, expression grim but resolute. Even Ser Brynden Tully, who was known for his stern judgments, admitted that the bastard of Bolton was a worrisome ally, but a damned useful one. In private, Ramsay wondered how long he could maintain this facade of controlled cruelty. Part of him chafed at the restrictions. He missed the total freedom he had once enjoyed in the Dreadfort's dungeons, where no one questioned his amusements. Yet a deeper part of him recognized that, thanks to Roose's leash, he was rising in influence. Serving King Robb provided a broader arena to display his talents. Perhaps when the war ended, the spoils would include an official legitimization or a generous land grant. The idea of a future in which he was not just the bastard of Bolton, but a recognized lord, sent an electric thrill through him. Back at Harrenhal, Roose Bolton received reports of Ramsay's successes. The war ravens described the bastard's valor in flanking maneuvers and intelligence gathering, always appended with disclaimers that he remained as vicious as ever. Yet no formal complaints had been lodged by fellow northern lords. No open condemnation from King Robb. Roose allowed himself a small, satisfied smile whenever he read such missives. His gambit had worked. By restraining Ramsay's worst impulses, he had forged a terrifyingly effective weapon. For House Bolton, this war was turning into an unprecedented opportunity. Still, Roose never let his guard down. He knew how precarious alliances could be in times of war. One day, if Robb Stark's fortune soured, House Bolton would need to adjust. Roose had not forgotten the possibility that the Iron Throne might win out in the end, or that Stannis Baratheon could claim victory. The game was far from finished, and for every victory the Starks achieved, new dangers arose. But in the meantime, Roose continued to entrench at Harrenhal, gathering intelligence of his own through spies and well-placed bribes. If circumstances changed, he intended to be prepared. For now, though, under the watchful eye of Robb Stark and the disciplined oversight of Roose Bolton, Ramsay's cruelty was guided, directed at the enemies of the North. House Bolton, once infamous for treachery, had become a formidable, if still unsettling, pillar of the Stark war effort. As battles ebbed and flowed across the ravaged landscape of the Riverlands and the Westerlands, whispers spread among soldiers and small folk alike. The flayed man fights for the wolf. In a realm torn by war and haunted by uncertain loyalties, that was no small thing. Fearsome and ruthless, the Boltons commanded respect, forging a new chapter in their house's history alongside the Starks. At least for as long as Roose could keep his son's darkest instincts under control, and as long as Ramsay found fresh enemies to feed his twisted appetites. No one could say how it would end. War was fickle, alliances shifting like shadows, and the crown in King's Landing still pulsed with power. But for the moment, the North stood united. The Boltons marched under the direwolf banner, their ominous sigil trailing side by side. And if the quiet threat of flayed skin lingered in the nightmares of Lannister men, so much the better. They had learned that in this war, mercy was scarce, and the bastard of Bolton far scarcer still. If their screams served the young wolf's cause, then so be it. And if, someday, the tides of fate reversed, it would be the nature, and in the grim calculus of war, that cruelty, properly aimed, might well turn the tide in favor of the king in the north. Such was the precarious balance upon which the fate of the North rested, with Roose Bolton's calm cruelty guiding his bastard's savage impulses. The flayed man wore wolves for now, but in a world splintered by crowns and claims, NLY the gods, old or new, could foretell what might happen if ever that balance broke. Only one thing was certain: with House Bolton lurking behind the Starks, enemies of the North had good reason to fear, and perhaps, in some corner of the war-torn realm, a mother still wept over the stories told of Ramsay's hunts. Yet in the grand halls of Winterfell, or at the towering black walls of Harrenhal, or in the snowy courtyards of the Dreadfort, Lord Roose Bolton merely smiled, a secret, hollow smile, and reflected that every terror has its use. For if the cruelty of Ramsay was the hilt of a blade, it was Roose's measured hand that wielded it, ensuring that House Bolton remained, at least for this war, a loyal, though ruthlessly efficient ally to the Starks.